Panagiotis Poulos and Kostis Kornettis. Could you please come? Right, Panagiotis Poulos is one of the scientific coordinators of the current project. He is a lecturer of Islamic arts in the University of Athens. And Kostis Kornettis does modern history, teaches modern history, among other things, in the University Carlos III, University of Madrid. Is that right? The floor is yours. Is it you? Okay.
Yeah, I think so, yeah. Okay. All right. Okay, maybe I can start while Panos is solving the technical problems. Yeah, exactly.
It's all in French, that's the problem.
It's what?
It's all in French. So.
Okay. All right. So hello again. I want to start with a quotation. This is not the first one now. Okay, I can see that the PowerPoint is completely random. Yeah, I guess it's because it was from a Mac. Yeah. Can you open the PDF?
Oh, yes.
I think that's the best. Okay, I'll start anyway so that we don't waste time. So, time uses, this is a quote, time uses the same edifice. Yeah, that's the one. Time uses the same edifice on different levels. Even though it had been surely a church at first, then it turned into a mosque, a coffee shop, a pharmacy, a phone center, a tobacco depot, a restaurant, an office, a cabaret, and a cinema. I imply, of course, the edifice where Alkazar is currently housed in front of Caravanserai, where necessity imposed a dense cohabitation of the public. These words belong to novelist and painter Nikos Gavril Pedzikis from his book Mother Thessaloniki in 1970. Hamza Bey, the oldest Ottoman-built mosque in the city of Thessaloniki, built in 1467-68 and rebuilt in 1620, was a space that operated in various ways throughout the better half of the 20th century. In fact, from the mid-1920s onwards. Oh, again, how did that happen? Okay, so this is just a painting by Papaspirou. Situated in the very center of the city, in the corner of Egnatia and Venizelos streets, and opposite of the old clothes market, the Bezesten, also dating back to the 15th century, Hamza Bey was part of, it was partly destroyed by the fire in 1917, and it was part of the exchangeable properties of the Lausanne Treaty, even though we did not manage to find the documentation at the land registry, as opposed to other well-known mosques, namely Yeni Jami and Alajai Maret in 1925. But we know that it was pronounced a diatiriteo monument. You can see here the government gazette from 1926, so under Pangalos, alongside Alajai Maret and a number of Byzantine churches. The space was nevertheless turned, it was auctioned and sold, and it was turned into a phone call center in the late 1920s. Then it was bought by a Jewish businessman who turned it into a cinema alongside other things. Here we can see a graphic advertisement from 1936 depicting Well, the building itself and these people rushing to watch the movie of Mikros, well, the Little Lord. During World War II and the Nazi occupation, in 1942 actually, its owner was arrested and thrown into the Pavlos Melas camp run by the SS to be shot in reprisal execution. As Mark Mazauer notes, the cinema owner was told that he would be released only if he appointed new managers nominated by the press and propaganda office. Indeed, the cinema was rented out to a refugee from Ceres. A transfer of Jewish property to beneficiaries of the Germans that would in fact initiate an entire cycle of property expropriation that, of course, would reach a climax in the winter and spring of 1943. The space's owner, after the war, Nikolaos Segouras, preserved its function as a cinema and consolidated it as one of the most popular movie theaters in the city. In this first part of our presentation, I shall resort to the lived experience of the people who remembered the cinema in their writings in order to trace their feelings towards the space and its surroundings. As architect Pelagias Trinidou notes, we have to approach collective memory of these spaces based on lived experience and personal memory. I will focus on Alkazar. Of course, this is a word coming from Alkazar, the Arabic, meaning castle. So I live in a country in Spain which is, of course, full of Alcazars, but none of those is a cinema. Anyway, I will focus on Alkazar and its repertoire and function in post-war Salonika as a nostalgic space, and I will refer to movies without, however, offering a full list that was screened. And then Panos will talk more about this former sacred space and the various mobilities of its subject. So we're going to move from memory and materiality to materiality and the senses. Soon after the war, with the city altered irreversibly and with its once prominent Jewish community almost entirely wiped out, and right in the middle of the Greek Civil War, Alkazar started to serve as a space of recognition for refugees from Asia Minor and beyond. As a kinematografos πρώτης προβολής, Alkazar functioned as a popular space that gathered people right after work, people of a certain social class, in terms of family entertainment, forging new subjectivities and reinforcing old ones, and forging a new sense of togetherness and socialization. However, according to novelist Giorgos Ioannou, and it's okay. It's fine. A description of the people who frequented the cinema in the immediate post-war period, it was primarily a male space. That's another one. So, leave it here. Ioannou says, I quote, "The popular cinemas par excellence, Attikon, Ilion, and Alkazar, were situated in the big commercial roads next to the markets and the car retailers. In the mornings, these were normally not frequented by women, but they were full of men. During weekdays, they were full of people, especially after getting dark. Then builders, blacksmiths, chauffeurs, small clerks, and soldiers would arrive." Initially drawn into the grand American movie epics of the time, Alkazar quickly switched into a cinema specialized in melodramas, and melodramas of all kinds that aggrandized its spectatorship. Indian movies, Indian melodramas in the late 1940s and early 1950s, Turkish melodramas, especially in the 1950s, and Greek ones in the 1960s. The repertoire of Turkish films, in particular, was enhanced. As Kokkalidou Nahmia notes, quote, "Refugees would spend day and night in Alkazar. They would laugh, they would weep and mourn as they watched Oriental movies, Turkish ones, with the food, with the elderly, with the kids." And she quotes the owner, Ms. Segouras, saying these were glory days, 3,000 tickets every day. Kokkalidou's description could be read through René Hirschen's observation regarding refugee cinemas in Kokkinia. In a chapter entitled The Ottoman Past in the Refugee Present, Hirschen recounts how Smyrnid refugees regarded Turkish films. She quotes, and I quote, "Cinemas regularly showed Turkish films which were especially popular among the elderly women who praised them for their high moral tone, semnotita. Outings to the cinema provoked nostalgic reminiscences, providing glimpses of the countryside and landmarks of their former homes. I heard Turkish proverbs quoted, end of quote. Stella Voyagoglu remembers about her grandmother, and actually she's imitating the Pontiac dialect, I quote, Alkazar screens good Turkish movies, I heard the voice of my father's stepmother saying. She was originally from the far Orient. And on top of this came the description. Το κορίτσι μπακάμ, πολλά τραβούντανε, τούτο και τ' άλλο, αλλά και πολύ ωραία χορευούντανε και τραγουδούντανε. All those movies had the same plot, according to Grandma, and actually they did, indeed. Many films were indeed focusing on music and dance, and often involved the presence of Munir Nurettin Seljuk. And I guess, oops, can we go back? This, no. Anyway, here you can see also some other advertisements of movies from the time. And I think it's right before, yeah, exactly. So here you can see two movies which are advertising explicitly Munir Nurettin, who, Seljuk, the most famous Turkish singer of the first half of the century, one of the first big recording stars. One of his most famous songs, recorded in the 1940s, was called simply Aziz Istanbul, Beloved Istanbul. As anthropologist Martin Stokes notes on Nurettin, perhaps one of the most striking aspects of his song is the opening call to prayer from the minarets of the mosques he sees below him in Istanbul. Stokes interprets this as a distinctly modern scenario in which the bass line of ancient places and rhythms, just like in Baudelaire, Proust, and Joyce, evidence a modernity which does not obliterate them, but pushes them into the background, like gouges indicating the passage and continuation of time. Munir Nurettin's call to prayer, thus, might be seen as an evocation of the old rhythms in order to signify their transcendence by the new. What is more, Greece's and Turkey's parallel ways to modernity are somehow evoked and embodied by Nurettin and all that he symbolized. This observation is particularly pertinent here, whereby the oldest mosque in the city, Hamza Bey, is indeed placed within the very modern activity of cinematography, while its former function, architectural standing, and overall religious and cultural semiotics are relegated to the background. Nostalgia, of course, is omnipresent, but according to the foremost specialist of its functions, Svetlana Boym, it can be also restorative and reflective. And actually, one of the, if you noticed, you can see the word nostalgia mentioned also in one of the posters. Anyway, of course, not all visitors of Alkazar were nostalgic of the Ottoman past. As Astrinidou mentions, for some residents of Thessaloniki, lingering enmity toward anything Turkish came out. Some people stress the fact that they did not like the couleur locale part of the building, and that the owner preserved its Orientalist features. For instance, film critic Giorgos Lazaridis wrote with surprise in the newspaper Kinematografikos Astir in January 1951, I quote, "Even though the owners of Alkazar took particular care of the entrance of the cinema, they left, however, the same ... Oriental appearance of the theater intact." Another interesting factor is that, different from the early days of Protis Provolis attracting males, these movies attracted a predominantly female audience. As the gender hierarchies changed radically, this also gave rise to new practices in the cinema, such as the infamous kolitirdzides. What is for sure, and this comes out in more than one recollection, these movies were extremely popular. Elenia Badzi notes on the social function of Alkazar, using rather interestingly the word Mecca to describe the space, in a sensory but equally melodramatic description of viewers' reactions. Actually, her description is interesting because, in a way, it mimics the melodramatic, trope, let's say, of the plots themselves. It's not this one. What a mess. Okay, that's the one. The Salonican Mecca of Indian movies was Alkazar, the old Hamza Bey Mosque on a central spot on Ignatius Street. That cinema had a central role in terms of screening social dramas. It would switch from Indian to Turkish, to Russian, to Greek melodramas. This is where female workers and saleswomen would go after work in their neighborhoods. This is where servants from good households would go on their day off. Some people would go too who wanted to poke fun on the tragic scenes on the screen. In the morning session, people would come from the nearby market with their groceries, and the cinema would get stuffed with grocery bags with cabbage and onions, while tears were flowing in the corridors like rivers. So notice the affective inversion and subversion of the genre and the seriousness by people who wanted to have fun, also mentioned in other testimonies, like the one, for example, by present-day historian Yorgos Anastasiadis, who remembers that as a youngster he would like to disrupt Turkish or Indian melodramas, and people who watched, he used the words, solemnly got angry. Now, one of the most poignant and interesting testimonies belongs again to Ioannou. And again, of course, Ioannou is the most important, or one of the most important commentators regarding the city's role as the capital of the refugees. In a text combining the particular sense affect that this space produced in the viewers, Ioannou says, in Alkazar, when the film is good, and not some terrible porn, you can feel an ecclesiastical relief, and the person sitting next to you very close. So, it is exactly the sensorial and corporeal engagement that Chamilakis mentioned and Sotos, Dimitriadis mentioned before. The references to a church-like feeling and the idea of elevation, anύψωση or anakouphisi, as well as the notion of togetherness and closeness, is extremely compelling in terms of the afterlives of this building and a sense of religiosity lingering on. What is captured here is the moving nature of the films or movies, again with words, of course, that we used in the title with Panos for a reason. More than that, the ecclesiastical comparison in Ioannou's narrative, just like with the solemnity mentioned by Anastasiadis or Mecca used by Abadji, plays firmly, albeit indirectly, Alkazar as a cinematic space within its long duress history of a sacred space. And okay, so this is just a glimpse of the building in the 1960s. This was published in a book Υπόλοιμας by Kalogeropoulos and Andreadis 78, but the photo is from before, and here you can see how it looked like the interior of Alkazar. Things were bound to change over time. I just have some other, we can go, okay, Poneμένη Χανούμισσα, you can see, all the Ζητιάνος Ανατολής, Nazli, there are lots of recollections about Nazli and, whatever happened to Nazli and the storming passions of this figure, στα κύματα του Βοσπόρου, η αμαρτωλή του πέραν, and it goes on and on like this, Ματωμένος Βόσπορος. Of course, the entire notes in the advertisements are also very, very interesting. Again, reinforcing the sense of nostalgia. And I guess that's the last one before turning to the next one, which this is the 60s, and we are in the Greek melodrama realm here. Αγάπησα και πόνεσα, μας ενώνει ο πόνος. There is a lot of Martha Βούρτση, Nikos Xanthopoulos, and so on and so forth. I think we can go on, Thila του Πάθους. So we turn from the Turkish and the Indian to the Greek ones in the 60s and 70s, before switching to karate and porn later on. The changes in the buildings, I think there is a couple of more. Okay, I think that's the last one. The changes in the building's function, but especially its transition from a space of social interaction and collective remembering, orientalist or whatnot, to a space of consumption of porn is particularly striking. This connects well with anthropologist Navarro Yacin's theory, because it also goes together with the gradual ruination of the building itself. So Yassin theorized the ruination and abjection of buildings formerly belonging to the other in her fieldwork on Greek Cypriot properties in northern Cyprus. Abjection and ruination for Yassin refer to the material remains of artifacts of destruction and violation, but also to the subjectivities and residual affects that linger like a hangover in the aftermath of war. Many reminiscences, in fact, focus on the miserable state of the space after the 1990s, or even before. And that's the last quote by Abadzi. Alkazar's fate depicts the evolution of the viewer's needs. When people stopped being moved by social dramas, the cinema switched to violent action movies and porn. In 1997, that supposedly diatiriteo space was deserted and in bad shape. And these are pictures that I took some weeks ago. And again, you can see the ruination. The interesting fact about Alkazar is hence the placing of a modern medium within a pre-modern spatial context, as well as the combination between nostalgia, at least in the initial decades after the war, with ruination and abjection afterwards. It is telling that for younger people today, the building represents a rather odd apparition with no apparent meaning. And,
thank you, Kostis. So far, Kostis has been unraveling various testimonies, stories that connected certain Thessalonians, or probably a whole generation of the city's inhabitants, with the relatively recent history of the building and its subsequent uses. This diverse in content and intention stories through the repetition in the form of local literature or newspaper entries normalized the ambivalent status of this monument/cinema and generated new subjectivities in post-Ottoman Thessaloniki. These stories, interwoven with the plots of the extended lineup of movies screened in the converted atrium of Hamza Bey Mosque, turned the building into an affective space and emotive domain, to quote Yael Navarro-Yassin. This affective property, apart from the actual physical site, right there in the middle of Egnatia Street, resonated also in the visual representations, postcards and photos that claimed visual moments of the city's recent past. These moving stories that construct the recent history of the building should not be juxtaposed to a still and motionless history of the mosque prior to the Treaty of Lausanne and the population exchange. This rare photo of Hamza Bey's courtyard atrium, which according to the stamps on the back is assigned to the Section Photographique de l'Armée, quite popular these days in Athens. I'm referring to the exhibition that opened yesterday. Dated sometime in the late 1910s, while the mosque was still functioning, captures a fairly dynamic phase of the building's Ottoman history right in the front of the threshold of its monumentalization. That being so, it captures the very transitional moment in the building's history, but also previous layers of its dynamic interaction with the city's material culture. The photo depicts the enclosed courtyard of the mosque, an impressive later addition to the original structure dated in the 1960s, at the end of the 16th century. The late Byzantine capitals of the columns, you can see them at the top of the image, provide evidence of an earlier movement of material in the city, as well as within the limits of the broader neighborhood of the mosque. Thanks to the meticulous work of the team of experts, Konstantinos Raptis et al., at the 9th Ephorate of Byzantine Antiquities, which started in 2007, following the construction works of Thessaloniki's metro, we are now in the position to know about the identity of this spolia that originated, among other churches of Thessaloniki, in the church of St. Minas, further down the road from Hamza Bey Mosque. It is interesting to note that while at that time the emerging interest in the Byzantine monuments on the city on behalf of Ottoman bureaucracy found its way in the section entitled Ancient Monuments, Asari Eatika, of the yearbooks, the Salnames, as Edem Eldem has eloquently demonstrated, these capitals, as opposed to roots of other spolia, did not attract the attention of those serving the city's history. Neither was the intention in the case of the photographic gaze of Section Photographique de l'Armée to focus on the Byzantine sculptures. As stated in the note on the back of the photo, this is a scene of prayers in honor of Muslim soldiers who lost their lives in the field of honor. While these late Byzantine sculptures survived the cinematic, as we've listened from Kostis, transformation of the building, other components of the material culture of this mosque, captured by this photo, had a rather different fate. Among those are the carpets, whose decorative motifs are fairly clearly depicted, offering themselves to the experts in order to be studied. Thanks to a document published by Evangelos Hekimrou, we do know about the carpet dispute that followed the history of the implementation of the Treaty of Lausanne in Salonika. A pious Muslim and photographer by the name Ali Sami Bey addressed a letter of complaint to the prefect about certain Ottomans, I quote, who were planning to carry the mosque's carpet to Turkey. Ali Sami Bey argued that since the carpets were part of the pious endowment's property, it was illegal to extract them from the mosque. As opposed to the carpets, there is an untold story of the Islamic calligraphic inscription plates, the levhas, as called in Turkish, 4 of them pictured hanging on the southeast wall of the courtyard. You can see them. 3 of them are fairly readable, and they are at the top right of the picture, of the image. Calligraphic plates of this type, apart from the obvious visual impact, have a very strong oral quality as they are related to a mosque's recitation practices. I'm after here the work of architectural historian Nina Regin, who has done a lot of work on how inscriptions are connected with what is being recited in a mosque. The levhas fell also into the category of the movable property of a pious endowment, and according to the Treaty of Lausanne, could be carried along by those departing from Greece to Turkey. However, are shown in a study by Nükhet and Nuri Adıyeke of 4 registers recording the property of the Muslim community in Macedonia between 1912 to 1923, there were 103 levhas that were either confiscated by the Greek state or left behind at the departure of Muslim population of the cities. Just for the record of this story, there is actually a large corpus of levhas of this type, which can be reconstructed from various photographs. This is a photograph of Hamidi Edzami, mentioned earlier also by the speakers. And due to this, to Abdul Hamid's construction of albums, we have a very detailed and clear pictures. We can actually have a clear vision of the exact inscription program inside the mosque. The same registry records 358 carpets, halı, and 1,474 small carpets, kilim, as all part of the light furniture of Muslim public buildings of Macedonia. The late Byzantine capitals, the carpets, the calligraphic plates, but also the hanging chandelier, you can spot it again on the right corner of the image. The lamps and the candle box constitute elements of the sensorial regime dominated and defining the mosque's domain right in the course of transition, and consequently, their photographic depiction constitutes a strong visual evidence of this regime. Yet the ethnographic thick description of these photographs I have been exercising so far is meaningless without the actual actors, those inhabiting the mosque. The above-mentioned story of Ali Sami Bey, together with other evidence, points to the Ottomanist credentials of Hamza Bey Mosque. It is well documented that the last Mufti was accused of holding right in this mosque prayers and sermons that favored the deposed Sultan, Abdul Hamid. The wider neighborhood had always been a rather modest, yet commercial neighborhood of downtown Salonika, namely Tahtakale. At the beginning of the 20th century, the annual income of Hamza Bey's endowment was not that high, although it's a central mosque. It wasn't the most wealthy, we could say, as opposed to other central mosques in the city, like, for instance, that founded by Numa Pasha. Earlier sources document the presence of saddle makers and other craftsman professions in the neighborhood. The commercial identity of Tahtakale was further intensified by the caravanserai, the Büyük Han, built in the north side of the mosque, as well as the famous Bedesten, Kostis mentioned that, on the north-south axis towards the port. Back to the photo. What this visual document fails to convey is what these people are listening to. The actual sound of that moment might be irretrievable, yet the overall sound history of the building is not. The voice of the caretaker, the Qayyum and Muezzin of the mosque 10 years earlier, namely Osman Bey, recorded in the archive of the accounts office of the province of Selanik, Vilayet Efkaf Muhasebe Jilik. The reason was a claim by Osman Bey for unjust payment of his salary. Osman Bey, who traced his appointment as a muezzin in the past through a certain document, was receiving a monthly wage of 100 kurus, splitting it equally to the duty of muezzin and qayyum, caretaker. Yet, being the muezzin of this mosque was also entitled to an extra wage, subsidized from a yard, bahçe, located outside Vardar Kapısı, on the western part of the city. This injustice towards the duty of the caretaker, quoting the legal language of the document, was settled, as stated in the relevant document, by the Ministry of Imperial Pious Endowments, thus resulting in an overall rise of the monthly salary of Osman Bey. The above-mentioned case, apart from an individual story of employment complaint, is a story of endowing practices in late Ottoman Salonika and the way this regulated the sacred soundscape of the city's Muslim public space. Muezzin Osman Bey's case points to a practice observed also in other pious foundations of Salonika, like that of the Saraiatık neighborhood, Acheropeitos, for granted by Eyal Ginio. As observed in Ginio's study, endowments designated for various types of religious recitations supported the low-rank personnel of mosques, like muezzins, on a local level, that of a neighborhood, establishing, I quote, a vital civic society that could act independently on the central authorities' intervention, end of quote. At the same time, the effect of such choices on behalf of the endowers extended beyond the boundaries of certain neighborhoods, thus forming a wider, I quote, imagined community of beneficiaries through the city. Thus, founding a waqf outside Vardar Kapısı that was explicitly designated to financially support the muezzin of Hamza Bey Mosque in downtown Salonika offers us a glimpse into how the everyday sound of a mosque was subsidized, and therefore to its sound history overall. At the same time, the existence of such source of funding tell us about the mosque's dynamic position within broader socio-religious networks in the city. The archival sources do give us hints about the social aspect of the mosque's sound history, yet still the actual sound of the building remained lost. However, it was the voice of Osman Bey that resonated at the beginning of the 20th century on a daily basis in the courtyard of Hamza Bey Mosque, that space covered by the carpets, surrounded by the wall from which the levhas were hanging, and covered by the ceiling holding the chandelier, the candle boxes, and the lamps. It's only when all these features are brought together and their interconnections understood and exposed that the picture of this space becomes meaningful. Small incidents of the life stories of the mosque's actors, like Osman Bey, are interwoven with those of its aforementioned martyrial components, forming what Yannis Hamilakis describes as sensorial assemblages. That is, I quote, the contingent co-present of heterogeneous elements such as bodies, things, substances, affects, memories, information, and ideas, end of quote. These totally unrelated at first sight components are held together through sensorial flows. Sensorial flows constitute an act of intense movement responsible for establishing and regulating sensorial regimes like the one I attempted to foreground through this image thick description. But also, they are responsible for overthrowing them, as Hamza Bey's Mosque's recent history shows us. Thank you very much.